Well, hello. Welcome to HR Updates. My name is Pandy Pridemore, Principal Consultant with the Human Resource USA. We've got an interesting show for you today, but you know what? I think I start every show that way. So I'm not going to disappoint you. Today we're going to talk about accommodations. And I'm not talking about accommodations in the general sense. I'm going to talk about accommodations in the workplace and the EEOC. It's a very important topic. It's important to both the employer and the employee. So we've got Zach Weber and Faith Whitaker from Dinsmore joining us. You're going to like their segment. We're going to understand not only what an accommodation is, but when an accommodation is appropriate and how to recognize it. But the first half of the show is going to be on the major topic of unemployment. Okay, like any of you need to be reminded that we've got more jobs than we do people. I get it. But today we've got Walt Tracy, President of At Work Personnel here in Cincinnati. And he's going to I don't want to say define, but he's going to help us understand what some of you as employers can be doing to maybe help the individuals that not only work for you now, but the individuals that you're screening to better determine whether they're the right people for the show. I'm glad you joined us. So Walt's sitting right here. We might as well just start with him. Well, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pandy. Good to be with you.
It's so much fun being here, right? Last time you and I were together, it was virtual.
Exactly. So that's nice as well to see you, but much nicer to be in person. Absolutely.
You know, you and I talk on and off about some of the struggles that your clients are going through, and the story's the same, right? It's kind of becoming a mute topic, but at the same time, organizations like yours at Work Personnel, you've got two locations, Cincinnati and Kentucky.
Yep.
You're actually introducing employers to solutions to some of this.
Yeah, that's right. And as you said, probably don't necessarily have to restate, but maybe just to set the context, right? What are the latest numbers? About 10 million open positions out there, and a workforce that sits something like 4 to 5 million fewer than there were in February of 2020 before the pandemic hit. So that's the kind of worker shortage, labor challenge that our clients and employers around the country are facing. Well,
and you serve all sizes. It's not that you're just only working with the big companies here in Cincinnati. Yeah. You've got small companies as well as large, and you're seeing a definite pattern of that struggle trying to identify an individual interested in working.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, it can be the two-person office who needs a new admin person. All of us can drive around to restaurants and hospitality, as well as drive through the industrial parks and see the now hiring signs just about everywhere you go.
Well, and it's interesting. I've now started thanking people. So if I'm in a drive-through or if I'm in a restaurant, I'm thanking them for being there to work because it's important to us. So let's talk about what services are maybe underestimated or underutilized when it comes to actually finding the right person for the position. Because I'm so intrigued by some of the programs that you offer.
Yeah, and I'll get to some of what we do in a minute, but the first place I would start on that from an employer perspective, it's just retention, right? So in a place where it's hard, we know employers are also facing this great resignation out there, so people are moving quickly. Start with the leaky bucket, right? Make sure you're doing everything you can do to hang on to the talent that you already have, and whether that's compensation, flexibility of benefits. Saw an interesting study the other day saying still, a lot of those same old things matter in terms of just alignment with what your company's purpose is. The old, people leave their managers, not their companies. So are you doing the right things from a management and supervision standpoint? Boy, just making sure you're tuning up all that stuff, just to at least make sure that you're holding water, right, and not losing talent on top of the shortage that we already have.
It's interesting. I had a meeting this morning, and one of the questions that came up by the person chairing the round table was, an employer wants to know if they hear of somebody grumbling and saying they're looking for another job, or you find the resume on the copier where they're copying the resume at work, should they go and approach that employee and ask, what is this true? Why are you doing that? Yeah. In my opinion, I have an opinion about that. Well, what would you say?
Well, I think if you have a clue like that, I'd maybe find a diplomatic way to approach the employee about it, but including even just like stay interviews, right? So we know of a bunch of companies who have gotten more intentional about their, conducting stay interviews and check-ins with people, and just doing things like that to get, temperature checks on folks, because it can happen so easily, especially depending on the role, the availability of remote work. Yeah. Can be very tempting for people. So that idea, I think, like I say, of regular check-ins, stay interviews, all of that we're seeing a lot more of that, and really important right now.
Well, and I'm going to add a little bit more too. My response to that was absolutely, because you don't know it. The individual may be suffering from harassment, yeah, or they may be feeling they're being discriminated against. Maybe there's a safety issue. They don't feel safe at yeah, the press or the machine that they're working on, and or maybe they feel that there's a pay issue that could be maybe a perception issue. Mm-hmm. Perception's 99% reality. Right. Get it cleared up. Yeah. Have that crucial conversation.
Absolutely. So, and like you say, all those things right now can be at play, right?
Yeah. I also think, though, that employers need to ask the right questions in the interview. Mm-hmm. What do you advise your clients when it comes to actually knowing whether this is the right fit for you?
Yeah, I think we still follow kind of behavioral, interviews, trying to, extract out of people, put them in situations where you've done similar work, and do that kind of thing to really try and dig into, have they had that experience before? How have they responded in those situations that might be typical of what they would face in your particular environment? And I think especially because, I know we've talked about this before, one of the biggest things we face, or if something doesn't work out, is kind of missed expectations, mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. And so, again, I thought the job was going to be this, and I got in there and it wasn't at all what I expected, or I didn't get to do what I thought I was, or the environment wasn't what I expected. There is a lot that comes out of the whole idea of missed expectations. So I think the process, whether it's interviews or other mechanisms that get you to everyone understanding what they're about to commit to and walk into, has a lot to do with how that whole thing ends up turning out. Right? Well, no one likes to be surprised on that, right? And
that's why I tell my clients, don't spend so much time on the job description, because that's not actually what they're going to be doing. Talk more about what the day-to-day looks like.
Yeah, I think that's right. And combination, I know we were going to talk a little bit about assessments and that kind of thing, but figure out what are, are there some important and meaningful assessments. But I think you're exactly right. And one of the, I think employers are so challenged by that. One of the values they find with staffing is this whole kind of temp to hire idea as well, right? So I can actually go in and observe somebody actually doing the job, right, before I commit to them.
You do.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, to better understand what their needs are.
Yeah, well, we'll go in. So we would always go over to our client. We want to observe the work. We want to watch the workers, see what their job duties are. What is the environment? You mentioned things like safety. Those are important for things, as well as just basic accommodations. Do you have break rooms? Do you have a place I can put my lunch? Do you have things like that? Mm-hmm. What is the safety? What is the supervision picture like? Again, how hard is the job? So just all those kinds of things, yeah, we want to go in and observe that, because we would always say to our clients, we want to represent you in the best and most accurate light to the people that we're interviewing for you, and the best way for me to do that is to get a feel for the work itself. And then, like I say, so I can also properly set expectations so you're not shocked when you go over there and find that this is what the line looks like, or this is what the office looks like, or again, the type of work involved.
And I think that's great advice for employers who are relying on their teams to also be a part of that interviewing process, and that they truly understand what the day-to-day looks like, and they're all speaking towards that same set of expectations.
Right.
I don't know how many times I've gone in and watched a team interview, and this person's calling the job title this, and this one over here is using a different job title, and the person interviewing had no idea what they were actually interviewing for.
Yeah, I think not only that, but what is the impression you're leaving with that candidate as well?
Well, there you
if
go.
they can't even talk about it consistently, you're wondering, does this company have it together, right? Again,
Yes.
Especially in a competitive an environment where you're competing for candidates, you got to, right? You want to put on your best foot forward.
Yes, you really want to court them,
Right.
but court the right ones.
Yeah.
If you know that there are certain competencies that you're looking for, certain skill sets, hone in on those. I really love the way you started the conversation of some of the interviewing questions, because that's really what they need to do, is focus on what the job needs are, and versus, well, what do you do in your spare time, or what are your hobbies, and what'd you do when you were in college? Yeah. Some of that really is irrelevant in some positions.
Yeah. No, it really is, and it's where even again education criteria and things like that have gone. Is used to be we would say you have to have a bachelor's degree to do this work.
Oh, good point.
No, what is the work? What's the skill set required? Let's talk about, have you demonstrated that, or do you again have a credential that shows me you've done that?
Yes.
And really get to exactly what you said. What is the actual duty, right? The duties that are involved, the work that's involved, and let's hone in on that.
And you work with candidates so much, so I'm going to flip the coin here for a minute, because when I'm interviewing, I always look at the individual and say, look, remember, you're interviewing this employer as much as they're interviewing you. Mm-hmm. So I always try to coach the candidates sometimes. Look, don't respond. Don't tell me what you think you're going to do. I'm more interested in what you've done. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of the same type of advice you give to your candidates when they're out interviewing with your clients?
I think so. I mean, it's a couple of things. So certainly being able to give examples of similar types of work, yes, again, that you've experienced, and that's why I say, on the other side of that, asking those kind of questions that lead to those kind of conversations are really important. Show me, talk about a time, right, when you have done this that looks like something we would do here. Yeah. So being prepared for those examples, and then the other thing, we find most clients want, and we try to coach from an interview standpoint, is just the idea of curiosity. So think about the questions that you would be curious about at the company. Really more, but work related. Again, maybe what are some of the challenges in the job? What are things like that? So we find our clients like someone who's naturally curious, because they're going to show some initiative and maybe come up with some new ideas and do things like that. Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to your conversation of temp to hire, because I haven't seen it recently, but there was a time when I would bump into companies that would actually say, well, I just wanted to try them out for a couple days. Yeah. Unpaid, they're just volunteering just to see if it works out. There is no unpaid interview. I mean, there's no working interview, I guess is the proper term. Right. With your organization, they can do that 90-day introductory period through a temp.
Exactly, and that's what I say. To me, that the combination of that and assessment is the ultimate in terms of identifying winning candidates for you. So, but the opportunity for someone to get a look at a client actually doing the work. To me, that's the benefit of temp to hire. We sometimes call it, risk-free hiring. It's not exactly that, but it does remove a lot of the risk in a lot of ways, right? Because once you've committed to that person, you've got benefits, you've got unemployment consequences if it doesn't work out, or just elongated performance improvement plans, or all those kinds of things that you have to go through if you got it wrong on the hire. And so what we're trying to do is essentially put a buffer in there that gives you, a really good look, but both, right? Both the company and the employee, right? Both of them get a really good look, so they're all identifying fit before they get to the end of that line. And I know in our situations, if you're a month in and you really like that person, there's an opportunity to go and buy that out. So it's not like you have to always wait 90 days or something like that.
Okay. Okay. And then, well, just for my employers that are watching, once they become a W-2 with you, then you get another 90-day introductory period. Hopefully, they can kind of review just in case.
Yeah.
So I think it's a win-win. But let's go back to the assessments. Help me understand, or help our viewers understand, what kind of assessments and which ones are the most popular?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it all depends on the industry that you're working in and everything. We do a lot of light industrial, for instance, and so we have a lot of employers who will just say to us, beyond all the kind of soft skill stuff, right? I want someone who's going to show up on time and work hard and all those kinds of things. They'll say we need some basic, again, what we would call almost like industrial math. So we need people who are going to be able to use a ruler, be able to maybe take a caliper and look at measurements. We need to be able to practice volumes. I'm mixing something, and so I need to know that if something says double the amount of this over this when I'm doing a mix, someone who can actually run those ratios. And so it ends up being, you don't have to be a calculus major or anything like that, but you do need some basic math. And so again, especially our manufacturing clients will say, hey, I'll train on almost anything once I get them in there in terms of how to operate a machine and how to do things like that. What I'm not willing to do is, teach them basic math. And so we see in the manufacturing environment just a lot of, so we run industrial math assessments with folks. But that can be everything, so move over to the clerical side. We have a lot of folks who are looking for basic data entry. Are you familiar with Microsoft Office? Call center jobs, how we can actually test on their customer service background, and a lot of times almost putting them into similar, behavioral situations. When you have a customer who does this, right, answer A, B, C, or D, and there's a right answer to that based on customer service experience. And so, I know we use a bank of, I think there's, 1,000 job descriptions in there that we can apply, potential assessments to. And so that's what I say, the combination of that and the temp to hire look, again, you got a pretty good feel for whether you've got a good fit for an employee.
Oh my goodness, that's absolutely, I don't think people realize that's available.
Yeah.
I mean, Myers-Briggs, the DISC, there's all these big assessments, and they get a little costly, but I think these kind of assessments are far more appropriate.
Yeah, and as you said, it depends on the job. If you're hiring for an executive, maybe looking at the DISC and the Myers-Briggs and everything, and so again, what we primarily are working in are more frontline positions of a broad spectrum, but I think you're looking more for technical skills. Technical meaning technical to whatever those job duties are for that particular role, and that's what we focus on. So yeah.
Now, if you're looking at a candidate coming in saying, I want you to find me a job, do you do the assessments right away so that you have a better idea of what jobs to put them on, or do you wait till the client asks?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really becomes client by client. So it's more that we've worked out in advance with clients. These are the types of assessments that are appropriate for you. So typically we're doing an interview with a new candidate. First of all, kind of to define, more generally, almost like what lane they're going to be in,
Okay.
right? So if they're primarily in there and they already kind of know they want to work in a warehouse and do some pick-pack work or something, we probably aren't going to run them through the math assessment necessarily,
Okay.
unless for some reason that client has asked us for that. But so it really depends on. It works at the level of the client and the role that we're working, and then if we find someone who at least looks through preliminary interviews, like that might be a potential, then we'll put that assessment with them. So we don't run them through kind of an assessment battery to see where their best fit is going to be. We'll try and, like I say, kind of assess some of that through the interview, and then if it's an assessment's appropriate, direct them that way.
What advice do you have for candidates right now that are considering going back into the workforce? Because we got to get them back into the workforce.
Yeah.
The individuals that are sitting out there, we've got to get them back into the work. What advice do you have for them?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, I think the first and most obvious is to say to you, it is a great market for you right now. Like, get up and get at it. If you've been afraid for various reasons, and I know there are reasons why people have been out it, but if you think you want to go back to work and everything, now is a great time. Employers are very eager. Wages are up dramatically over the last 9 months or so. Companies are baking in flexibility into their offerings in order to attract. So it's really hard to imagine a better time, literally in like the last 40 years, for someone to be coming into the job market. So. Again, compensation, benefits, flexibility, all the things you kind of want with that as an employee, those are all trending up right now. So it's a great time to be in the market. You have the opportunity also because of that to be picky. So come to us where we might present a variety of opportunities for you. But certainly as you're even, whether you're looking through Indeed or talking to your network or however you're going about your job search and everything, kind of don't settle for the first thing that comes along. Make sure you're looking and evaluating different options and figuring out, again, the fits that are best for you because again, the market is great for you.
Not everybody has a resume. So what advice do you give to candidates that may not have a resume, or maybe the resume hasn't been updated for a long time? Is that still a necessity?
For most roles, I would say it is.
Okay.
And so again, there are some frontline positions where maybe it's not as important, but a lot of times the resume is important. A lot of times the resume, even outside the skill set, just to show kind of job history and job skipping and those kinds of things.
Okay.
People very much are still looking at that.
Okay.
So I would definitely recommend, and like ourselves and other agencies will often help you with your resume. There's also a number of kind of job readiness outfits out there that will kind of help you in resume preparation. Of course, these days you can find anything on the internet, and so there are plenty of templates out there and all that to do that as well.
Yeah, and for those housewives that stayed home over the last 1.5 to 2 years to take care of their children, it's okay to admit that, right?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, everyone understands.
Totally
so if you have that
okay.
resume and that gap is in there, that's very explainable, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think all you have to do is be able to say, hey, here was my situation, and I think everyone understands the challenges of the last 1.5 years. So there's certainly an understanding around that.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit of a hesitation around that, and I think everybody needs to kind of get over that.
Yeah, I don't hear as much about, or certainly I haven't seen any client worried about a gap from that standpoint.
Good.
Again, that's very explainable.
Good. So you've given advice to the candidate, so what about the client now? What about the employer?
Yeah, boy, it's hard. Like I say, again, I go back to making sure you've done a compensation review, making sure you've
Good point.
done a full compensation review. So I'm including benefits, all that kind of stuff in that. Again, it's got to be best foot forward on this. There's still We continue to see openness on kind of sourcing options, and so again, in the space we work in, that might be, more openness to groups like Second Chance Citizens, or kind of non-traditional hiring. Being willing to go in and look in some of those places, some of those pools of people and everything. Okay. So maintaining openness around some of that. But you've got to, obviously you can work with us, but whatever you're doing out there, I know our sourcing strategy is everywhere right now because of the challenge of finding people. So you've got to be aggressive in how you're writing your job descriptions for your job ads. You've got to be playing on social media. You've got to be doing everything you can in kind of your workforce pipelines, or with job readiness groups, or doing all schools if there's a particular trade or background that you're looking for. So you've got to be very aggressive from a sourcing standpoint to tap into all of those options.
Okay. I have to add one more thing. For the candidates who are interviewing, I still like to see a thank you note. I know it's so old-fashioned, but even if it's just an email acknowledging, thank you for your time, I think that's just a little added touch, because we're not getting the fragrant and remember the textured resumes
right.
of the late 80s,
yeah, it used to
early
be,
90s.
Kind of how thick the thread count on the paper was and everything, right?
Yes, because they wanted that one to fall out
it's
first.
It's embarrassing that you and I have been around enough to see that. So
I remember getting a pink one. I remember getting a light pink resume, and it had fragrance to it. And I thought, oh, well, you did it. Yeah. Yours is standing out. Yeah. Well, thank you.
But I do think, it's a great point. Anything communication-wise, right? That is so meaningful, whether it's a thank you note, even a call, a voicemail, something like that, just to know communication means so much. I think on both sides of it, right? Boy, if you're if you're on the employer side, same thing, right?
Acknowledge those individuals you're not going to hire.
Exactly.
Just let them know that you at least got your information.
Right, and especially now, nurture your pool, because they may not have been a fit for this, but the next job that the Great Resignation deals you might be that you need that same candidate.
Yeah, and referral bonuses are always a plus when it comes to extra benefits. Walt, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I knew this was going to be a really easy conversation. Yeah. Our prep wasn't really extensive, but you and I get along so well. Yeah. I really appreciate it. Again, this is Walt Tracy over at Work Personnel here in Cincinnati in Northern Kentucky. You can reach him at www.atworkcincy.com, or my email is wtracy, WTRACY, same thing, atworkcincy with a CINCY.com. He's got a great team. He really, really does, but you can always call and talk to him specifically. Let him know you saw him on HR Updates.
Right. Pandy, great to be with you. Yeah, enjoyed just chatting over all of this.
Thank you. Well, stay with us, because the second half of the show, we're going to go right into that great topic of EEOC and what's an accommodation and who might need it. Stay with us.
Leaves us with the next item on our agenda is item number 5, opening session.
I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. If you're out here at the parade or listening, thank you again.
Into the end zone, and that is caught by Jaden Wood. Come on now, how we doing? Y'all feeling all right out there?
Hello, and welcome to this edition of This is Glendale. I'm Bet Chorus.
Hey guys, this is the Unit 1 crew from One Log Fire Department. We just want to wish you guys a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
And of course, you can always go to ICRC-TV.com.
Always a great day when ICRC is involved.
Another edition of ICRC, bringing the community to you.
Welcome back. You're watching HR Updates, and my name is Pandy Pridemore. Dinsmore showed up for this section, and I'm so excited. You remember in a previous show I told you that I get these wonderful announcements from Dinsmore on different updates and different announcements. Well, one of my favorites, Faith Whitaker, sent one the other day, which I just couldn't ignore, and I had to get on the phone right away. I guess I emailed her and said, Faith, you're coming on the show. So please help me welcome Faith Whitaker and Zach Weber, attorneys who specialize, experts who specialize in employment and labor law.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
It's great to be back and in person.
And in person,
And actually in the flesh.
virtual last time, yes. It's so much fun because this is our second live show. And Zach, you're a rookie.
My first time, and I get to be in person the first time. So
He's the lucky
how lucky am I?
And new chairs.
Yes, thank
You
you.
got to join
Fancy
the new chairs. Well, you know, we haven't talked a lot on the show about the EEOC. It comes up in conversation. We reference it all the time. And of course, COVID has absolutely, we cannot ignore the EEOC and COVID. But what I thought we would do today on this segment is really help our viewers understand the EEOC in regards to accommodations. And that is such a difficult thing to wrap your arms around, because when we're talking from an employer perspective, this is guidance that the entire management team should understand. This isn't just the HR person. This is the entire team. Where do you want to start, Faith?
Maybe just starting with why we even care about accommodations and why it's such a separate, challenging issue. Because I think when we're as employers and employees alike, you start by these anti-discrimination laws. And that's kind of how the basis for the EEOC is, that they are the federal agency to enforce those laws.
Okay.
But why accommodations are so tricky is because it's not saying, okay, treat everybody the same. It's now saying the opposite of that, essentially, and saying now you need to individualize these people or these employees or applicants based on their accommodation and what their needs are. So it's a different mindset for employers and employees alike. So I think that's why it's so challenging.
Well, when the American Disabilities Act actually came into effect way back when, we thought about ramps, we thought about, actual disabilities like the loss of an arm or the loss of an eye. But those rules have changed drastically.
In 2008, they updated it, and now what we joke around even in our world is that you essentially assume a disability. I mean, that's more so. We used to attack whether or not they were qualified disability under the Act. Now we more so assume it. I mean, of course, you can ask questions, and you will as an employer, and then employees need to provide information. Yeah. But the real questions are, can we accommodate it, and what does that look like, as opposed to, are they disabled?
Okay. Now, an accommodation is not going to be the same for every single person, but one of the biggest misunderstandings for the clients that I work with is that they said, well, the employee never asked for an accommodation. They don't have to.
You want to take that one?
Yeah,
she's tagging you in, Zach.
It's one of the trickier parts of this. What is an accommodation and what do they look like? Because there's no one-size-fits-all prescription. And to your question, does an employee have to ask for an accommodation? The technical answer is yes, but there are no magic words for what a request looks like. It might be an employee just saying, hey, I'm having a really tough time reading my monitor. That might trigger some type of disability accommodation. It might be an employee saying, hey, this conflicts with, I have Bible study on Sundays, every single Sunday, and I don't know if I can work these shifts. That might end up being an accommodation request. So it's not that employers have to listen for, I have a disability accommodation request or I have a religious accommodation request. You're not going to encounter many scenarios where those are the words that come out of the employee's mouth. So yes, they do have to request it in some type of language, but what that language looks like might vary drastically from person to person.
Which is why, to your first point about how managers need to know about this and why training is so important, is because most often the initial request, or at least when the employer's on notice that potentially there's an issue and the employee may need an accommodation, starts with the front line usually, not an HR person. We wish it would go to the HR people who are hopefully more knowledgeable about it.
Yeah.
But the managers, if they just brush it away, then that could cause some issues, both with the employee not getting the accommodation that they need, and then also, of course, the employer potentially having some liability issues.
And I love the fact that you pull this over off just the concept that accommodations are medical. They're not just medical. You used a religious reference.
Yes, so as employment attorneys, we encounter two different types of scenarios where accommodations are necessary under the law. Two different laws, which, we can get to that, but they are going to be disability, which are extremely common, I think, in Faith and Mai's experience, because the definition of what a disability is under the ADA is so broad at this point. It's much less common, but there are scenarios where employers will have to provide accommodations for what the EEOC calls sincerely held religious beliefs. So yes, those are the two kind of main buckets of what accommodations will look like for employers.
Okay, so let's just start at the very beginning. Does an employee have to be employed with a company for a period of time to get the accommodation?
No.
It could be applicants.
It could be applicants, exactly. So help us understand what they should be listening for, what questions they can ask, starting at the very beginning of the applicant process. Because that's not a question we see on applications.
The standards are going to be, for the ADA at least, we can kind of take religion out because it's a little bit different, lower threshold. But for the ADA, there are specific things that employers cannot ask at all. So you can't even inquire into medical disability for an applicant. So that gets tricky because a lot of times you might, unless of course you notice something. So for example, if somebody comes in a wheelchair, that's a more obvious disability, and you may be able to ask, again, I don't say that you can because sometimes depending on the situation, if they're able to perform the job.
Okay.
So if it's a job where they need to be really mobile, that might be a problem. Once they have an offer of employment, then you can inquire with a little bit more detail on what the candidate can or can't do. And then when they're employed, it's different as well. So I think there's sort of three buckets from the disability standpoint.
Okay.
But from religion, I mean, same thing. If the applicant, you say this is what the schedule's required, and it's on Sunday, but the applicant still has a right to say, well, but I've got this religious accommodation need that potentially should be met and not work Sundays.
And it can be even trickier than that. There's a famous Supreme Court case from, 2015, somewhere around there, that involved Abercrombie and Fitch, where an applicant applied online. She was very interested in fashion and wanted to work at Abercrombie and so forth. And she shows up for her interview in a hijab. And the employer admitted later on that they had reasonable belief that she was Muslim and this was part of her religious practice. They didn't mention it during their interview. She didn't request an accommodation, but they did not offer her the job on the basis that she would not fit their appearance standards if she needed to wear this during her work. And so there was no explicit request, there was no explicit denial, just not offering her a job. And the Supreme Court found in her favor because this was basically, they didn't even open a conversation about what an accommodation might look like. So, it can be a little bit tricky. So basically, if an employer is on notice that an accommodation might be necessary, the burden is kind of on the employer to have that conversation and see what might be possible.
I love the way he's going to fit right in.
That's what I thought. I knew it.
You segued right into my next. So, and there's a legal, well, not say legal, but there's a nice term for that conversation, and that's
interactive process.
Interactive process. And it's not taught. It's amazing how many clients I will go into and I'll say, well, who started the interactive process? This is just a conversation. This is an engagement between the employee and the employer to say, oh, well, tell me, how can we help? It's just that simple. Zach, yes. I mean, do you coach your clients to do anything more?
Absolutely. I mean, we coach them on how to conduct the interactive process because it's not just suggested, it's a required step. Once an accommodation is made, it's pretty settled law that employers don't have to offer the first accommodation request if it's not possible or if it's going to cause a big disruption or cost a lot of money or so forth. But if they can't offer the employee a preferred accommodation, they are required to begin this interactive process. And what that is asking the employee questions of, are there any other accommodations that might help you be able to perform your job duties? Are there any other, policy exceptions? Are there any other, can we move you to a different part of the building or offer you a different schedule or things like this that might be an effective accommodation, but not necessarily the employee's preferred accommodation? And that's what it looks like. It can be one conversation. It can be over the course of months and months and months to determine what the best outcome of this is, but it is required under the law.
Like with anything that you probably see in what you do, this is usually the interactive process step is where we see if there's ever an issue, that's the issue. Just like anything with a lack of communication or miscommunication. And so this is such a crucial time to just ask the question. But you're right, a lot of times employers don't even know necessarily that they need to ask just, well, how can we help? And that simple question can go a long way, and it may not even end up being an issue.
Well, and I think part of it is because there's a lack of partnership between individuals who truly know what, like an HR person, or maybe it's just the owner who's been trained properly, and that frontline supervisor, as you said, who's the hands and ears and eyes of the business. So let's go one step further. Someone has asked for, and this is what I do, so correct me if I'm wrong, I'm gonna learn something here. But I tell my clients, if an employee comes to you and asks for a change in their job based on a medical condition, the bells are going off. I mean, the bells, the flags, everything, the lights are flashing, and that's when we start the interactive process. Now, it might not go anywhere. But if they ask for a change, now, if someone says, I'm dyslexic, but they're not asking for a change in their job, that's not necessarily a request for an accommodation. Zach?
Correct. It might not be, but the employer should make note of that. At that point, they are disclosing a disability, at least a potential disability to the employer. So, the employer should at least take note, be aware that if later on they say, hey, I might need a different monitor, or I might need a time exception to this particular task, even though the employee doesn't relate that directly to dyslexia, the employer should be aware that there might be a connection there, in other words.
Or even poor performance.
Correct.
Or a change in performance.
Which is usually when, a lot of times, these things come out. It's, well, wait a minute, you've been absent so much, and then it's just goes, well, that's because I've been dealing with this issue, whatever that is. And so it's, or you've been late on your whatever deadline. Well, that's because I've been dealing with this issue. Yeah. So then it's difficult. Doesn't mean that you don't need to, of course, follow your policies and procedures as an employer, but you still need to put pause for just a second to figure out, okay, well, what's going on here, and making sure that we're tackling any kind of accommodation issue.
And if that does occur, it might be a great opportunity for the employer to be proactive and say, is there anything I can do for you at this point? And if, because sometimes the employee, again, there are no magic words. The employee might be disclosing this because he or she is feeling pressured to perform a certain task or difficulty in a certain task. If an employer opens that conversation by saying, what can we do for you to help? They might say nothing. They might say, everything's fine, just wanted you to know. They might say, I'm having a really tough time with this particular part of my job. And that initiates the interactive process right there, so.
Well, let's go one step further. Okay, so we've identified that we're having this conversation, and maybe somebody does need an accommodation. I don't know, they need an extra break because of diabetes, or they, need to sit down every 4 hours or such. Okay, what kind of documentation should employers be thinking about to either verify or justify or clarify?
And this gets into a lot of different back and forth, but essentially it's enough to discern that there is a disability. We can do that. If it's not known or obvious, completely obvious, like a wheelchair or something like that. But enough to understand what the limitations are and what the employee needs. The one thing that I get, sort of one of my pet peeves, is when some of our clients only want a doctor's note. And I say, it doesn't have to be a doctor. And in the law, it's a healthcare provider. And of course, you don't want to go to a chiropractor when you've got some other totally unrelated issue, and that wouldn't necessarily make sense. And with this pandemic, we're seeing a lot of mental health issues. So that's another thing. It's like, well, but a therapist or something like that may actually be enough to suffice for this, as opposed to just a doctor.
Yeah. If our viewers could only see the list of individuals who can verify FMLA. I mean, yes,
Exactly.
Everything but a voodoo doctor is on
And
that
even
list.
they might be able to be at this point. I don't know. I haven't checked recently. So.
So the ADA is very simple. And the ADA does not have specific format. I mean, there's some very specific information we'd like to have, but it's not in an actual form printed and formatted by the ADA.
That's exactly right. And that's where I think another issue that we see is when you've got somebody out maybe on an FMLA leave, so Family Medical Act, they've got all their forms, they've got all those steps very clear.
Yeah.
But then they exhaust their leave, but they still need more leave. For us, that's when the ADA potentially just jumps right in there, and there is no complete format. So that's a lot of areas where people get confused. Well, wait a minute, but they exhausted their FMLA. Yeah, but they still could potentially have accommodation by another unpaid leave based on the ADA.
I love the way you said that, because let's remind our viewers too, ADA can be stacked on other activities like the Family Medical Leave Act or like workers' comp. These things can all run at the same time. And again, you've got to have somebody who's trained to understand the intricacies of each particular program, or something's going to slip.
Yeah, and to just, to kind of piggyback on Faith's example, let's say you have an employee who had never disclosed a disability or medical condition or anything even resembling a disability during their employment, and then requests FMLA, fills out all the paperwork. You have documentation as an employer saying this is a condition that's going to require an extended period of time away from work. When the FMLA leave ends or expires, and the employee says, I'm not ready to come back to work because I'm not going to be ready until this date, essentially what they're doing is requesting an accommodation, even though the wording is not, it doesn't fit this neat model, but through the FMLA process, you have become aware that the employee has a medical condition and now requires extra time, which is essentially an accommodation. So, these things don't take, it's never one size fits all. Everything's very much a case-by-case scenario.
And FMLA has it's a whole different topic, has its time period, but ADA has no time limit. It could go on for the entire employment period of the employee, and some of my clients get really upset with that.
It's so difficult, and it really is. And that, I think, is a call that we get, I would say, once a week.
Oh, my.
That scenario, where it's somebody has exhausted FMLA, and then now they're sort of on this extended leave, and they keep extending it. And so then the question, and this, not to get into too many legalese, but it's, unless it causes an undue hardship. But that's not a bright line rule, but like a lot of things, it's a lot of factors.
Yeah. And
it's the cost, and it's the operations. And the question I always ask is, well, what have you been doing to cover for the employee while he or she is out? Well, we've managed, we've just had people kind of pitching in here and there, but maybe it gets into overtime. I mean, so these are the factors that you look at, but it's definitely not something, I think that's a really tough standard to meet. And the other thing is that would be the employer's burden to prove. So you have to prove discrimination as an employee, but for employers, they have to prove that, oh yeah, we can't accommodate you because of this undue hardship. And that's a really high threshold.
Zach, take us, or Faith, explain to the viewers that you can't displace or inconvenience or change someone else to accommodate the one with the accommodation, correct?
I mean, the short answer is it depends, but there's a long answer. So the courts that have interpreted the ADA and Title VII for religious accommodations have come out with, I won't say black letter law, but they're somewhat cleaner rules than we're used to, where we know that employees are not entitled to indefinite leave. They have to give you some estimated timeline of when they're able to return, even if that keeps getting extended. You're not required to hire an extra person to help that person perform their job duties. You're not required, employers are not required, I guess, for example, to create a new position for this employee because they're no longer able to perform their job duties. So there are guidelines, but even within those, the actual inquiries we get from clients they never quite fit these neat guidelines. There's always one other factor that might affect the advice we give them.
Yeah, and pregnancy is considered.
Absolutely, yes.
That's a big one.
And a lot of state laws too, of course, come into play with pregnancy as well. But yes, pregnancy it was different before. It used to have to be a higher threshold that you'd had to have sort of a complicated pregnancy, but now that's not really the case. So, and again, it's going back to, originally the Pregnancy Discrimination Act was treat pregnant women as you treat anybody else. But now it's a step further, and you need to accommodate, not just treat them the same. Actually, you need to give exceptions.
And that could be different every week.
Absolutely, yes.
So I'm going to go back to the paperwork or verification. When we go over to the accommodation for religious needs, who's providing that? Are we still asking for the same thing?
No, it's similar, but there are different standards for ADA accommodations and religious accommodations. Slightly different standards. They're very similar, but they're a little bit less burdensome on the employer for religious accommodations. So,
Okay.
the process is the same. Again, you might get a very direct request, or you might get a very ambiguous request for an accommodation from an employee, based on, and again, we know this has to be based on sincerely held religious beliefs. It can't be personal beliefs. It can't be political beliefs. But what sincerely held religious belief looks like, it might just be a person's, genuinely held moral belief that's not based on an established church. That would still qualify. A philosophical belief not based on any type of, theology would still qualify in this case. So again, there's a wide spectrum of what we have to be looking out for as employment counsel and as employers. So the process, though, employers are allowed to do a limited factual inquiry. It's EEOC talk is what,
Say that again.
A limited factual inquiry. So once an employee comes and says, I need to change my schedule so I can show up an hour late and leave an hour early each day because there's a church function I attend every day. And you say, okay, that's, if it's not a problem for the employer, the best route is just to say, great, go for it. Because generally speaking, it's best to assume that the religious belief they're relying upon is sincerely held. The limited factual inquiry comes into play when the employer might have an undue hardship, and they're allowed to say, hey, can you just give me the specific rule or policy you're requesting an accommodation for in the workplace, and what your religious belief is that prevents you from following that policy. And that's pretty much it. If the employer has a genuine reason to believe the employee is being dishonest about that, you might be able to take it a step further, but that is never something I've advised clients on. I would say that Faith probably is in the same boat with that. So you're allowed to ask a couple of questions, basically, and then at that point, it's typically just best to assume that whatever belief they're expressing is sincerely held.
Yeah.
That's usually it's like the disability in a way. Mm-hmm. Assume that this is, unless it's completely, you have an objective reason that this is absolutely made up or something, or you think so.
Yeah.
Assume, and then tackle the next issue, which is, can we accommodate it? Yeah. Which I think is almost a bigger issue, as opposed to, let me try to poke holes in, is this person even disabled, or is this person really telling me that they're sincerely believing this thing?
Yeah.
So it's hard for employers, though, because they're thinking, well, wait, maybe, for example, they just ate meat, and now they're saying that they're, whatever the case, that religion that doesn't allow you to eat meat. And so, and the EEOC even talks about how it is relevant, what they've done before, but it's not the full thing. So, because people can change, and they can all of a sudden adopt a new religion or a new belief. So that's very challenging for our clients.
Well, and again, training is everything. So training can be a paid clinic. It could be one of your seminars. It could just be a simple conversation with a labor law attorney to say, look, just give us some education on how likely am I going to have these kind of questions or these concerns, and who needs to be involved. Because what we're talking about today can affect any company. ADA is for 15 employees or more. Religious accommodation.
15 or more, but Ohio has 4 or more employees.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there are always layered state laws for every one of these things.
Which are basically essentially the same type of standard.
Well, and I always try to remind the viewers, if you've got remote workers, you have to abide by the state that they reside in. So please don't hold them to Ohio, Kentucky, or Indiana, wherever we're located here in the tri-state area. You've got to be aware of that, and if not, then you need to be talking to your attorney about that or your consultant and find out what guidelines you do have to work under. Remote workers can ask for accommodations as well as
Absolutely. And
in the workplace.
And one of the other accommodations we're seeing is to remain a remote worker, even if the employers are calling people back or wanting people back. And so that's been definitely a new, interesting analysis for a lot of our clients.
Well, and let's go back to, we haven't defined undue hardship. So that's where I see the clients many times say, well, I need that receptionist here because, I mean, that's an undue hardship. I can't have my front desk unmanned. She can't do that at home. Break that down. What is an undue hardship?
It's a significant difficulty or expense is sort of how the general rule is, but that's a number of factors. They look at costs, look at operations, the size of the business, what the business does.
Okay.
And we've even had cases where if, for example, the employee wanted something that was going to cost, let's say $2,000, and the employer said, well, that's really costly. Why should we have to buy that desk or whatever for this employee? Yeah. Well, the EEOC then asked, well, what's your P&L? Let's see your P&L. Did you need that Christmas party or that holiday party?
They will investigate that. I forgot. Yes.
So
I completely forgot.
I always caution our clients to not just jump to, well, that's going to cost too much, because it may not in the grand scheme of things. And so it's all relative.
And normally if somebody asks for one accommodation, they know they get it. Boy, those ergonomic things get real. I need my bench underneath my desk. Right? I need the larger, I need the pads. I need the special chair. And there's no end.
Yeah, and those things can apply to remote workers. If an employee had already been approved for a stand-up desk or a certain type of chair in the office, and the employer went to a remote work setting where that employee even was working only 2 days a week at home, they might very well be on the hook for an accommodation for those exact things in the person's home.
You did so well. You did so well. You must be able to just hear what I think. But what am I forgetting? What other details do we need to share with our viewers today that to kind of wrap things up?
I think for both employers and employees alike is to make sure that they're communicating as best as possible and documenting it. So for employees who do need an accommodation based on either religion or some sort of medical issue, make sure that they're explicit about it. I need help. I'd like to talk to you about my medical issue. And for employers, to make sure that they're documenting that they're engaging in these conversations and that they're almost doing a chronology of sorts throughout the interactive process and making sure that everybody's on the same page and continuing to check in with the employee on the issue.
Yeah. Zach, anything to add?
I think that those are the important things. One thing I think that employers need to be constantly reminded of, and Faith does such a good job with making this sort of her default, is skip the part of whether you're checking whether this disability is a disability or whether this religious belief is a religious belief, and just go to the accommodation. That's the practical part. If it genuinely is an undue hardship that's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars or completely disrupt your operations, that's one thing. If it's a minor disruption or a minimal cost, then just go ahead and do it. It's going to save you a lot of headache and costs and lawsuits maybe in the future.
Absolutely. And our training tip, you get a training tip every show. Your training tip today is get your team trained. Even if you don't want them to making that decision in terms of what a reasonable accommodation is or if it's an undue hardship for your company, and truly those decisions should be made by your senior leadership, but get them trained on what to listen for. And not, as Faith said, not to make those rash decisions if there's performance issues, if someone's showing up late, and we've got some behavioral issues that we're a little concerned with. Jump into that interactive process. You've learned a new term. Start it. There's no perfect way of doing any of this. You just have to do it. So get your team trained on what an accommodation is, how it might affect your company, and you'll be much better for it. Zach Weber, Faith Whitaker, thank you so much. But here's a secret, guys. They're from Dinsmore, so I'm going to use them again. I want you to watch the next show because next month we're going to have them back and we're going to take this topic one step further. What do we do when somebody's asking for an accommodation in COVID and around COVID and involving COVID? Because the rules then again change one more time. And what about the vaccine? How do we provide all these accommodations, or any accommodation, when it comes to the vaccines? My name is Pandy Pridemore, and you've been watching HR Updates. We really appreciate you showing up and watching, and we appreciate that ICRC-TV gave us one more hour. We hope to see you next month.